This video was brought to you by Ground News. Towards the end of last week, US President Joe Biden hosted his Japanese and South Korean counterparts for a landmark summit, in which the two Asian countries appeared to put decades of difficult relations behind them, in favor of greater cooperation in the face of a growing security challenge posed by both China and North Korea. So in this video, we'll take you through the summit and what was agreed, explain its significance, and consider whether Japan and South Korea's improved relations are actually likely to last. Now, before we delve into the summit and the subsequent statements, it's important to note that this was not a declaration of a formal three-way alliance. However, it did represent a significant step towards greater cooperation and was symbolically a big moment. In fact, it's the first ever standalone trilateral meeting between the leaders of the US, Japan, and South Korea. Now, in some ways, Japan and South Korea seem like they should be natural allies, given that they're both US-allied democracies in a somewhat dangerous neighborhood. However, the two countries have difficult relations, largely dating back to Japan's imperial occupation of Korea between 1910 and 1945. With that in mind, it's clear why Joe Biden chose the Camp David presidential retreat to host the summit. Camp David has been the site of a number of historically significant diplomatic moments, including talks between Soviet leader Khrushchev and US President Eisenhower in 1945, and the landmark 1978 Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel. But history aside, what actually happened at the trilateral summit last week? Well, a joint statement by the three leaders titled The Spirit of Camp David, it says that the summit inaugurated a new era of trilateral partnership. Delving deeper though, one of the big announcements of this was that the US, Japan, and South Korea will hold annual multi-domain trilateral military exercises on a regular basis, which the US says will bring defense cooperation to unprecedented levels. The three countries will also hold annual trilateral meetings among foreign, defense, finance, and other ministers, as well as speeding up information sharing on North Korean missile launches, and also committing to consulting trilaterally on threats affecting collective interests and security. In addition to greater military cooperation, the three leaders also pledged to continue working together on things like supply chain resilience, particularly on batteries and semiconductors, of which Taiwan is the world's undisputed top producer. But it goes beyond that. For each individual country, the summit marked an important moment. As the Observer writes, for Japan, it was another step further from its post-war pacifism towards being a fully militarized member of the US Western Alliance. For South Korea, it may end up being seen as the moment it finally moved on from the bitter feud with Japan, though for now, mostly just at a governmental level. And for the US, it was a diplomatic win for Biden, and the latest in its series of moves to bolster its Asia-Pacific bulwark against China, with South Korea and Japan in the north, down to Taiwan, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and Australia. So, with that in mind, and given the historic tensions that we've mentioned between Japan and South Korea, how did this summit ever come about? And how did these people actually end up agreeing on anything? Well, there are a few factors at play here. Now, one major factor was the election of Yoon Suk-yeol as president of South Korea in 2022. Despite some of his moves being unpopular at home in South Korea, Yoon has taken a markedly warmer approach to Japan than many of his predecessors did. And he sought to develop friendlier ties with Tokyo by resolving points of tension that date all the way back to Japan's occupation of Korea in the first half of the 20th century. Most notably, Yoon announced earlier this year that South Korea would not seek reparations from Japanese companies for Korean victims of occupation-era forced labor, but would instead fund that compensation from a South Korean state-run foundation. Yoon also visited Tokyo in March of this year, in what was the first summit between leaders of the two countries for more than a decade. That summit, according to the Japanese Prime Minister, was the first step towards normalizing relations, as the two countries agreed to ease trade controls, resume an intelligence sharing pact, and more. Now, Yoon's steps to improve relations between South Korea and Japan have been warmly welcomed by the US, which has long pushed for its two allies to come together. And as such, this change in approach from South Korea was an opportunity that the Biden administration seized upon, quickly inviting both sides to this summit. Now, it's worth saying that all of this has happened within a geopolitical context that has effectively pushed these countries closer together out of necessity. First and foremost is the impact of China. The looming threat of an invasion of Taiwan and the country's wider push for influence in the Asia-Pacific that the US is trying so hard to counter. In fact, the post-war statement references the, quote, dangerous and aggressive behavior supporting unlawful maritime claims that we have recently witnessed by the People's Republic of China in the South China Sea. It's not just China pushing these countries together, though, with North Korea's continued build-up and testing of its missile arsenal on a scale that the joint statement described as unprecedented, also pushing these countries closer together. And of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and indeed its growing cooperation with China and North Korea, has pushed the likes of South Korea and Japan into reconsidering how their security strategies fit into an international order which has been shaken to its foundations, in the words of Kishida. All of this leads to a big question then. Will the so-called spirit of Camp David actually last? Or will the moment pass and South Korea and Japan fall into their previous, more acrimonious relationship? Well, for starters, the positive relationship may struggle to survive if South Korea's President Yoon, who is limited to a single term and leaves office in 2027, is replaced by someone willing to defy public opinion by cozying up to Japan. Additionally, the US's role in this might change if Donald Trump is elected as president in 2024. He's previously voiced skepticism over how much Washington benefits from its military and economic alliances, and took a uniquely friendly approach to North Korea during his presidency. Nevertheless, the Biden administration has stressed that it is trying to build a trilateral cooperation that will persist regardless of who's in power, by institutionalizing the key elements of the summit agreement. In fact, Biden said that all of this will create some momentum year by year, month by month, to make the relationship stronger and more certain to remain in place. Equally important, though, is the fact that even if goodwill between South Korea and Japan does fade, the shared security challenge posed by China and North Korea looks unlikely to disappear. So we may reach a point when cooperation is just a necessity. Regardless, though, it'll be interesting to see how these threats from China and North Korea continue to impact South Korea, Japan, and the region as a whole. And the best way to do that is with Ground News, a website and app designed to help take the power of the media into your own hands. Here's how it works. Every day, Ground News ingests over 50,000 articles from all over the world, and then they organize those articles by story. For each and every one of these stories, you can see how many sources are reporting on the topic, as well as checking out the political leanings of these sources and how they balance out at a group level. You can then compare the headlines of each source to see how they're reporting on the same story, as well as reading each and every article without ever leaving the app. For example, take a look at this story which discusses Xi's claims about the Chinese economy at the BRICS summit. Now, Ground shows us that only 8 outlets are actually reporting on it, with us able to examine their bias and find out that 57% of them lean right and just 14% lean left. And with that information in mind, you can swipe through different headlines to compare how each outlet covers the story, which is especially interesting when they're state-owned outlets like this one. As such, Ground News is a super useful tool for our current media landscape, and I honestly think an app like this will only become more essential as our media landscape continues to evolve. Now, our team at TLDR likes Ground News so much that we've decided to offer a 30% discount on the Ground News Vantage plan to all of our viewers. And that includes access to a feature called My News Bias, which is basically a dashboard for your news diet. Sign up to find out how your reading habits change over the next week. What are your top sources? Are you engaging with diverse perspectives? What about your favorite topics? Find out with Ground News Vantage, which is 30% off only using our link. So make sure that you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.